In the hushed stillness of a world lit only by torches, hearth fires, and the silver bloom of the moon, there existed a quiet medieval realm where countless curious rules shaped the rhythm of life. Some of these rules sounded odd, peculiar, or even laughably strange to later generations, yet at the time they were simply woven into the fabric of daily existence, their purposes hidden in the folds of survival safety and the soft, fragile order that kept entire villages at peace. And so, like soft strands drifting on a nighttime breeze, the rules were accepted, repeated, enforced, and quietly obeyed by farmers tending their narrow strips of land, by innkeepers watching the glow of lanterns sway along cobbled streets, and by every sleepy traveler who passed down roads worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. In this soothing, slow-moving tale, we drift along those old roads, visiting hearts of towns where people lived under laws that, to modern ears, feel strange, yet to them felt as necessary as the rising of the sun. The story begins on a gentle fog-wrapped morning in a small medieval settlement called Eldershire, where dew clung to thatched roofs like tiny glass beads, and even the roosters seemed to crow more softly, as if mindful of some unwritten ordinance governing the peace of dawn. Eldershire was not a place of grandeur or significance. Rather, it was the kind of village that rested quietly between forests and streams, the sort of settlement travelers passed through without remembering its name, though they always remembered its calming air. It was a place where the people lived by many rules written down. Rules recited to children, and rules understood without ever needing words. One such rule governed bread. In Eldershire, a baker was forbidden to sell a loaf that weighed less than the village standard, a requirement enforced not out of strictness but compassion. Bread was life, and no one was to be cheated of it. Bakers were even known to add a small extra portion, what would later be called the baker's bonus, to ensure no villager went hungry by accident. This rule may have seemed unusual, but to the medieval mind, fairness in food was the first line of defense against hunger, mistrust, and unhappy hearts. So every morning, the warm scent of bread drifted through Eldershire, a reminder that tiny laws upheld gentle stability. Nearby, the village square hosted gatherings where people discussed matters of local life. There existed a quiet rule that every meeting must begin with a moment of collective silence. Not prayer, not ritual, simply silence. To later centuries, this custom would seem odd and purposeless, yet its origin was rooted in a desire to settle disputes before they formed. The silence allowed tempers to cool, let thoughts mature, and gave each villager a moment to reflect on the weight of their words. Arguments rarely escalated in Eldershire. The silence rule ensured it. Another peculiar rule lived in the heart of Eldershire's forest boundary. Every family was required to keep a lantern burning at the front of their home on nights when heavy fog rolled in from the river. This was not because the villagers believed in phantoms, though old tales whispered otherwise, but because travelers often lost their way in the thick, silvery fog, and lanterns served as beacons of safety. It was a strange sight. Entire lanes lined with flickering lights on misty nights, creating an otherworldly glow that blanketed the village in gentle gold. But this odd law had saved countless wanderers from stumbling into marshes or wandering deep into the woods. It was a rule born from kindness, a communal promise to guide the lost. There was also the rule of water, the decree that no one, under any circumstances, was permitted to wash clothes in the main village well. To modern minds, the rule seemed obvious, but to medieval villagers who had no formal education in hygiene, it was a rule that saved lives. Centuries earlier, an outbreak of illness had swept through Eldershire when an unsuspecting traveler washed muddy garments in the well. Since then, the village created the washstones along the riverbank and posted wooden markers that warned people not to soil the well. The rule might have looked excessive to outsiders, but the people of Eldershire obeyed it with unwavering diligence. For they still remembered stories of the sickness that once brought sorrow to nearly every door. And yet, among all these gentle rules, perhaps one of the strangest involved bedtime. It stated that every household must extinguish their flames, candles, hearth embers, lantern oils before the night street bell rang. For fire, in medieval times, was as dangerous as any blade. Homes were built from timber and thatch, entire streets crafted from wood, and a single ember could burn a village to the ground. So each night, as the mellow ring of the town bell drifted through Eldershire, families would breathe out their flames. In the darkness that followed, the stars shone brightly over rooftops. The quiet settled like a blanket, and people drifted into sleep knowing they had followed a rule that protected them all. Dotted across the landscape were other customs rules whose reasoning seemed small yet deeply practical. One rule declared that shoes must be removed before entering the communal grain storage. This odd law had nothing to do with etiquette. The villagers observed it to prevent dirt and tiny pebbles from mingling with the precious grain. Grain was their lifeblood through winter, and even the smallest contamination could spoil it. And so, people patted softly inside, leaving their leather shoes outside in neat rows. Another curious norm dictated that shepherds had to tie little bells to their flocks, not for decoration, but so wolves could be heard long before they arrived. The jingling of sheep across fields might have sounded whimsical to travelers, but to villagers, it was a system of early warning. Whenever the steady rhythm of bells suddenly shifted or fell silent, shepherds knew danger lurked nearby. This rule not only saved animals, it preserved the livelihood of families who depended entirely on their wool and milk. Along the river, a wooden sign carved with curling letters stated yet another rule: no fishing on full moons. To passing outsiders, the law seemed almost mystical, as though it were tied to superstition or the influence of celestial bodies. But in truth, the rule arose from simple observation. Fish surfaced to feed more actively on full moon nights, making them easy prey. If villagers fished freely on those nights, the river stocks might vanish within a season. And so the rule existed to let the river replenish itself. Under the silvery glow of the moon, the river lay undisturbed, shimmering quietly. In Eldershire's market, there was an unusual rule involving colors. The vegetable sellers displayed their goods in baskets arranged by hue dark greens beside lighter greens, reds with oranges, and so on. This habit was not for beauty but for practicality. Buyers could tell instantly the freshness of produce simply by watching how each color faded over the days. When baskets grew dull in shade, the vegetables were nearing spoilage. The color rule had once saved the village from a wave of sickness caused by food past its safe age. Since then, every seller honored the tradition. But none of these were as strange as the law of quiet weaving. This was a rule placed upon the village's loom house, a rectangular stone building at the edge of Eldershire where women and men gathered to spin wool into strong, warm cloth. Medieval looms were noisy things, wooden frames that clacked and thumped rhythmically. Yet long ago, Eldershire had decreed that weaving must only occur at certain hours of the day. Not out of noise complaints neighbors were used to clatter, but because too many late-night weavers fell asleep at their looms, letting shuttles slip and threads break, wasting hours of work. The rule was born of practicality. Protect the cloth, protect the workers, protect the precious hours of daylight for tasks requiring alertness. And so weaving was permitted after sunrise and ended before dusk, giving the loom house a dependable hum during the day and a peaceful silence by night. Some rules reached even deeper into daily existence, touching matters of etiquette and interaction. For instance, one rule stated that visitors entering a home must speak a greeting before crossing the threshold, even if the homeowner already saw them. This custom began not for politeness but for safety. It prevented misunderstandings when people approached quietly or unexpectedly. In a time when tools, animals, and even people could startle easily, announcing oneself reduced risk. So greetings became obligations, not courtesies. A soft "good day" or "may I enter?" drifted through Eldershire doorways countless times each day. There was also a rule concerning night walking. After the lanterns were extinguished and the moonlit silence descended, villagers were discouraged from wandering the streets. It wasn't forbidden, but the understanding was clear. Night was a time for stillness. Anyone who absolutely needed to go out had to carry a handbell and ring it softly at intervals. This was not for fear of bandits or wolves. Eldershire was safe, but to prevent misunderstandings. If someone heard footsteps in the darkness without the soft ring of the bell, they might think danger approached. The bell rule had prevented many unnecessary alarms. Soft jingles became the gentle soundtrack of late-night movement, rare but unmistakable. The forests held their own set of rules as well. Eldershire maintained a small patch of trees called the Old Wood, an ancient forest where the villagers gathered herbs and mushrooms. They had a rule that anyone entering must place a carved wooden marker at the edge of the trail, indicating they were inside. This habit did not spring from superstition, though the forest was said to have tricks of light that confused even seasoned gatherers. The rule simply ensured that villagers could know who had entered, and if someone did not return by sundown, a search party could form. The markers were shaped differently for each family, a rabbit for one lineage, an oak leaf for another, so the old wood's edge always displayed a gentle scatter of little wooden signs waiting patiently for their owners to emerge. Among Eldershire's softer customs was the rule of shared warmth. During winter feasts or town gatherings, no one was permitted to sit alone if space remained at another bench. This was more than hospitality. Medieval winters were hard, and warmth was precious. Too often, those sitting alone had grown ill without others noticing. The rule ensured that no person spent gatherings in isolation where signs of illness or distress might go unseen. It kept the community close literally. Benches were long and widely shared. People huddled together, breaths fogging into the air, sharing blankets and stories. It was a rule born of cold nights and caring hearts. Then, too, there was the village's quiet rule of the river stones. Children were taught never to remove the flat stones embedded along the river path. These stones served as stepping markers, and over time they had been arranged so villagers would know where the river was safest to cross during dry seasons. If someone removed even one stone for play or construction, the pattern would break, and future travelers might misstep. The rule was simple, stern, and universally honored. The river path remained intact for generations, saving countless feet from slipping into sudden channels. Some laws, however, seemed on the surface to be nothing more than quirks, yet the villagers adhered to them with steadfast conviction. One was the rule concerning geese. Eldershire kept a community flock near the pond, and it was forbidden to chase or harass these birds. While geese were sometimes noisy and occasionally opinionated creatures, they served a vital purpose. They alerted villagers to strangers, animals, or disturbances long before dogs did. Their honking was the medieval equivalent of an alarm system. And so, though children were often tempted to run at the birds, the rule stood firm. Eldershire's geese waddled about with a regal air, knowing they were protected by decree. Another unusual ordinance was the so-called midday silence. At the height of the noon hour, when the sun reached its peak, villagers paused whatever work they were doing for a brief stillness. This custom began after scholars traveling through Eldershire once explained that the body needed rest at midday to avoid heat exhaustion during the hottest seasons. Over centuries, the explanation faded, but the custom endured. Every day, tools were set down, animals rested, and conversations hushed. It became a moment of peace woven into the day's rhythm, a pause that allowed the village to inhale deeply before continuing its chores. In the realm of sounds, there was also the rule forbidding loud musical instruments after dusk. Drums, horns, and large flutes were saved for festivals and daylight. The rule protected the nighttime from chaos, preserving the village's fragile rest. Soft instruments, lutes, harps, gentle reed pipes were allowed, and villagers often gathered around porches to listen to quiet melodies drifting through the cool night air. Music settled like mist across the town, creating pockets of warmth and closeness even in silence. On the matter of travel, Eldershire maintained a curious system. Each person leaving the village for more than a day had to record their departure in a wooden ledger kept at the old watchtower. Travelers inscribed their name, their destination if known, and the approximate date of return. This wasn't surveillance, it was protection. Roads were unpredictable, weather harsher still, and people sometimes vanished without immediate notice. The ledger ensured that if someone was overdue, a group could set out to look for them. It was a strange rule, yet one that expressed the village's most fundamental belief: nobody was to be forgotten. Eldershire also had an odd law about sharing news. No important announcement, marriages, illnesses, trades, disputes could be publicly declared until after the third toll of the morning bell. This rule prevented villagers from waking others too early with urgent declarations, and it ensured that minds were awake, calm, and ready to receive information. People gathered in the square after the third toll, creating a reliable rhythm for news and community decisions. The rule that puzzled outsiders most, however, was the decree that every household must keep at least one bowl of clean water near the hearth. The bowl was not meant for drinking but for emergencies. It served as the first line of defense if sparks flew from the fire. Tiny though the bowl seemed, it had prevented countless blazes, snuffing out embers before they grew into danger. It was a miniature fire brigade in a world built from flammable straw and wood. As the village continued to thrive under these peculiar regulations, the people of Eldershire came to understand the subtle truth they embodied. These rules were not born from fear, but from harmony. Each one served an unseen purpose, guarding not just individual lives but the well-being of the entire community. They were threads in a tapestry of survival and togetherness. Walking through Eldershire at dusk, one could hear the rustling of trees, the soft thump of looms winding down for the day, and the low hum of conversation as neighbors prepared to extinguish their nightly flames. Lanterns were gently covered, hearths carefully cooled, and soft laughter drifted from windows, illuminated by the fading light. The village settled into its slower rhythm, the rules embracing it as protectively as the night sky. And in this enchanted stillness, the strange medieval rules quiet weaving. Midday rests, lantern nights, threshold greetings, fog beacons, goose protection, walking bells, river markers, and countless others wove themselves into a comforting fabric. The villagers did not question them, for these rules were not burdens. They were habits of care passed down like heirlooms, guiding ordinary lives with extraordinary gentleness. And so the village lived on, year after year, generation after generation, carrying forward its curious laws, each woven with purpose, each rooted in wisdom, each born from the ancient truth that survival was not merely endurance but cooperation. And when the breeze brushed softly through Eldershire's lantern-lit, nights had whispered those rules into the ears of those drifting toward sleep, inviting them to rest in the quiet understanding that even the strangest customs may grow from the deepest kindness. The night deepened over Eldershire like a velvet cloak woven from moonlight and drifting clouds, and in the warm hush of that darkness, the strange medieval rules continued to reveal themselves, not through proclamations or stern enforcements, but through the gentle, habitual motions of the people who lived by them. These rules were not loud things. They were quiet, steady, almost invisible in their familiarity, and yet, as we continue our wandering through this sleep-softened tale, their subtle importance grows clearer, like stars appearing one by one in a slowly darkening sky. For instance, there was the peculiar rule surrounding the village benches. Most places might see wooden benches as simple resting spots, but in Eldershire, each bench carried a unique ownership, not of individuals, but of purposes. Some benches were known as listening benches, placed beneath trees where wind rustled softly through the leaves. Villagers sat there when they needed to reflect or listen to nature's murmurs. Other benches were story benches, reserved for elder villagers who loved recounting old tales to children's stories of lost travelers guided home by lantern lights, or flocks of geese rescuing the village from danger with their loud honks. People believed that sitting on a bench outside of its assigned purpose risked muddling the delicate atmosphere those benches preserved. And so, though it seemed strange, villagers respected the bench rule. It brought calm to the village's rhythm, as predictable and soothing as a lullaby. Another odd practice emerged from the rule concerning the village cats. Eldershire kept several communal cats whose purpose was far more important than their sleepy strolls and occasional mischief suggested. Mice and rats posed a great threat to grain stores, and cats were the protectors of the winter's survival. There was a law stating that no one was allowed to call out or yell at a cat unless the creature had done something dangerous, such as climbing onto a grain sack or knocking over oil lamps. Cats were to be treated almost like honored guardians, fed small portions at communal gatherings, given dry sleeping spots near hearths, and allowed to roam freely through houses. Outsiders sometimes found it absurd that a village held such reverence for wandering felines. Yet Eldershire knew that its survival often rested on the quiet paws and watchful eyes of those soft-footed protectors. There was also a curious, long-standing decree about boots in the bakery. No one was ever permitted to wear boots inside the baker's small shop at the edge of the village square. This wasn't about cleanliness alone. It originated during a harsh winter when snow, mud, and frozen dirt had ruined dozens of dough batches. From that crisis came the rule: remove boots at the door, step inside with warm stockings, and let the bakery remain a haven of warmth and cleanliness. Over many generations it became second nature to villagers. When entering, they would line their boots neatly along the outer wall and shuffle inside with gentle footsteps, immediately greeted by the comforting scent of fresh bread. Further into the village, on a path leading toward the southern fields, there stood a pair of tall wooden posts carved with swirling lines. Between them hung a sign stating the law of the boundary whistle. When farmers left the village to work the fields alone, they were required to carry a small carved whistle. It had a clear, piercing tone that carried easily across open land. The rule said that every so often, especially in fog or high grass, the farmer must blow the whistle once. If no answering whistle came from another nearby worker or shepherd, it meant that person was alone and should take care. Over time, this ritual evolved into a soft, periodic chorus echoing across the fields. A short note here, an answering tone there, a simple yet effective system of ensuring that no one vanished into the tall grasses unnoticed. The whistle rule kept workers connected, even at great distances. Near the riverbank, where reeds swayed and frogs croaked, there was a peculiar regulation regarding the clay pots that villagers used to gather water. Every family had to mark their pot with a distinct symbol scratched into the clay or painted with plant dye to prevent confusion. But the truly odd part of the rule was that each pot had to undergo an annual sound test at the autumn festival. A pot was tapped once with a wooden spoon, and if it did not ring with a clear tone, it was declared unsafe to use. Cracks invisible to the eye could weaken a pot, causing it to break during water collection. Losing water in the middle of winter was dangerous, and so the rule, though strange, was born from experience. The sound test became a cherished custom, with villagers listening for the musical chime of good pots and the somber thud of failed ones. Eldershire also followed an unusual custom involving the old stone bridge that crossed the Whispering Creek. The rules stated that no villager was to cross the bridge in silence. It was said that a person must hum, sing, or speak while moving across it. The origin of this law came from the echoing shape of the bridge's narrow passage. Travel by night could make even the gentlest breeze sound unsettlingly loud. Someone long ago believed that the sounds of one's own voice kept nerves steady and prevented sudden panic in the darkness. In time, the rule transformed into a charming tradition. People would hum soft tunes or murmur gentle words as they crossed, their voices blending with the soft creek below. Another odd ordinance concerned the seed barns where farmers stored early plantings for spring. Only 2 people were ever allowed inside the seed barn at once. This rule came after an incident in which too many villagers entered to help sort seeds, causing confusion that mixed varieties and nearly ruined a season's crop. Since then, entry was limited. Those 2 inside the barn performed their task slowly, speaking in low tones, labeling carefully, and moving intentionally. The rule cultivated a quiet reverence around planting, teaching villagers patience and mindfulness. Perhaps one of the most curious and endearingly gentle rules involved the town bell ringer. The bell ringer could not ring the morning bell before allowing 3 birds to perch on the top beam of the bell tower. This was not a superstition. It was a practical tradition that ensured the bell ringer climbed the tower at a consistent time each day, after the birds had begun their morning flights. The bell ringer, therefore, had a reliable sense of dawn's arrival. It prevented premature ringing during darkness or foggy mornings, keeping the community aligned with natural daylight. It also lent a soft poetic charm to the mornings, 3 birds greeting the bell ringer, the bell greeting the village. On the northern side of Eldershire lived a small group of potters who followed their own unusual rule. No pot was ever to be glazed on a windy day. To outsiders, this seemed unnecessarily strict, but the potters knew well that wind carried small particles of dust that could settle into glaze and ruin an entire batch. The village accepted the potter's rule, understanding that pottery was essential for storing grain, oil, water, and medicines. So on blustery days, the potters rested, spending their time carving intricate designs on unfired clay instead. Inside Eldershire homes, there was another time-worn rule. Brooms must always rest bristles up at night. This originated from concerns about pests, mice, or beetles nesting within the straw if left on the ground. By keeping the bristles raised, the broom lasted longer, stayed cleaner, and remained a reliable tool. Over time, it became an unquestioned habit. Every night, right before the flames were extinguished, brooms were lifted and placed bristleside upward like tall, humble sentinels. And then there was the traveling cloak rule, a curious decree that only certain colors could be worn when leaving the village for journeys. Cloaks of dark green, faded brown, or muted blue were encouraged, while bright colors were discouraged. The reason was simple. Travelers in bold hues stood out against the countryside, making them easier targets for bandits. Darker shades blended into the terrain, offering protection. What seemed odd to anyone passing through was actually a well-honed survival measure passed through generations. In the small apothecary's hut stood another rule, written on a wooden plank near the doorway. Say your ailment only once. The healer believed that speaking of an illness repeatedly gave it undue power over the mind, causing people to worry themselves into feeling worse. And so visitors stated their trouble once, clearly and calmly, then trusted the healer to tend to it. The rule encouraged a peaceful environment in the apothecary's hut, where herbs hung from the rafters and the air smelled of wild mint, lavender, and warm crushed resin. We move now to a glade just beyond Eldershire, where an ancient oak tree grew so large and venerable that its roots twisted like sleeping serpents and its branches stretched protectively over a patch of worn earth. Here the villagers honored the rule of seasonal gathering. Every spring, autumn, and winter, people met under the tree to exchange seeds, stories, and small handmade gifts. But during summer, the rule declared that the tree must be left entirely undisturbed. This custom arose from a belief that the tree was vulnerable during the height of heat and needed rest. Whether the belief held any scientific truth didn't matter. The rule kept the glade peaceful during the warm months, allowing animals to gather, plants to grow, and the tree to stand in dignified stillness. Along a winding lane at the village's boundary was the night turn rule, another practice that many found peculiar. If someone needed to travel through the village at night, perhaps to bring a midwife check on a sick relative or fetch water during an emergency, they had to pause at every fork in the road and turn slowly in a full circle. This was done not as ritual, but as a safety precaution. Turning allowed the traveler to let their eyes adjust to the shadows and check for obstacles, wild animals, or uneven ground. It also reset a person's sense of direction in the pitch-dark lanes. Inside Eldershire's small library, a single room filled with hand-copied texts, was a rule that no book could be returned in silence. One had to place it gently on the table and lightly tap its cover with 2 fingers. This soft tapping ensured the librarian, often busy with copying manuscripts, noticed the returning book. The rule prevented books from being misplaced or left unrecorded. Over time, the tapping sound became a gentle rhythm within the room, a heartbeat of shared knowledge. Even the communal dining gatherings had their strange regulations. At large feasts, no person was allowed to begin eating until the eldest villager nodded twice, signaling the meal's start. This was not a sign of strict hierarchy, but a practical measure. It prevented people from eating too early while food was still being served, ensuring everyone received a fair portion. The double nod was a soft, comforting gesture that unified the meal, giving it a tranquil and communal beginning. And then there was the rule concerning the weather readers, a small group of villagers who predicted storms, winds, and seasonal changes by observing cloud patterns, bird migrations, and the feel of the air at dawn. The rules stated that when a weather reader spoke, no one was to interrupt, even with polite questions. Weather was treated with deep respect, as it held great sway over planting, harvesting, and travel. When a weather reader shared a prediction, villagers listened in reverent silence, then adjusted their chores accordingly. It was a strange social rule by modern standards, yet it protected entire harvests. But perhaps the most mysterious law of Eldershire was the rule of second sunrise, a custom so old that its origins had blended into folklore. Once every year, the villagers gathered before dawn at the eastern hill. When the first light peeked over the horizon, they turned away from it facing west, instead waiting for the fields and rooftops to brighten behind them. This symbolic act represented humility, a reminder not to stare directly at blessings but to trust that they illuminated life from behind, surrounding people even if unseen. It was a gentle rule that calmed the spirit, making villagers feel held by something larger than themselves. As the story moves deeper into Eldershire, the full tapestry of these strange medieval rules reveals itself as something tender, protective, and deeply human. Each rule, though odd at first glance, blooms with purpose under patient examination. Together, they form a quiet world where survival, harmony, and community interlace like strands on a loom. And as lantern light dims, as night settles softly over rooftops, as villagers place brooms bristle up, whisper greetings at thresholds, hum across bridges, tap book covers gently, rest on purpose-specific benches, blow whistles across distant fields, and wait for 3 birds to perch upon the bell tower, Eldershire becomes a place where the unusual feels comforting, where every rule exists like a hand softly guiding someone through the dark, where everything strange was born from the simple, enduring desire to care for one another. The night in Eldershire settled deeper, as though the sky itself exhaled a long and peaceful sigh, letting the stars drift into place like drowsy embers rising from a quiet hearth. And under that tranquil darkness where distant owls hooted softly and the smell of damp earth mingled with cool night air, the strange medieval rules of the village continued to unfurl, each one revealing another layer of gentle reasoning, another thread woven subtly into daily life. One such rule was the lantern loop, a practice that guided villagers who traveled after sundown. Every lantern in Eldershire, no matter how small, had to be carried in a slow looping motion rather than held still. The idea was not ceremonial, it was practical. Wolves and wild dogs roamed the region, and a moving light confused these animals, making them less likely to approach. A still light, on the other hand, signaled a stationary human, an easier target. And so villagers walked with their lanterns swaying like small moons drifting in soft circles, creating a hypnotic dance of golden arcs that shimmered along the paths. Over time, the lantern loop became something soothing to watch. Children often fell asleep to the memory of these gentle lights swaying outside their windows. Another curious rule lingered around the old communal oven, a round domed structure near the center of the village. Though every household had a small hearth, the large oven was used for baking bulk loaves before winter or preparing meals for festivals. But the rule was strict. No one could place dough inside the oven unless they spoke a kind wish aloud. It seemed whimsical, even unnecessary, yet its purpose was deeply practical. A long-ago baker noticed that when people paused to speak softly, whether wishing for a good harvest or hoping someone would heal quickly, they handled the dough more gently and mindfully. This slowed baking, reducing accidents, burns, and rushed mistakes that wasted precious grain. And so the rule remained, turning bread-making into a calm, almost meditative act. At the far edge of Eldershire, where the fields thinned into scattered shrubs and pale mist rose each morning, another rule guided shepherds, the no-shouting rule. Despite common assumptions about herding, shepherds in Eldershire never yelled at their flocks. Instead, they used long, melodious tones, half song, half whistle, to guide the animals. Generations earlier, a bad drought had frightened the younger sheep, and shouting only made them scatter and injure themselves. So the villagers crafted a peaceful system of vocal cues, soft but effective, which soothed the animals and prevented panic. To hear a shepherd tending the flock was to hear music drifting over the hills, rising like a lullaby carried on the wind. Eldershire also held a peculiar requirement regarding the sharing of maps. If someone borrowed a map, whether of the forest trails, the old Roman roads, or nearby streams, they were obligated to return it with a small hand-drawn mark of something new they discovered. A fallen tree blocking a path, a new burrow near the riverbank, a patch of edible herbs, or a recently collapsed stone wall. It didn't need to be artistic or precise. The purpose was simply to keep the maps living, always evolving with the land. As a result, Eldershire's maps grew dense with tiny, hand-sketched notes, drawings, and careful markings made over decades. They told the slow, quiet story of the village's surroundings, how the woods shifted, how storms changed riverbanks, how animals moved through the fields year by year. In the heart of the village stood a tall stone pillar known as the memory post, used during storms and hard winters. The rule surrounding it was odd. Whenever thunder rumbled across the hills or snow piled dangerously high, villagers walking by the post had to touch its surface with their fingertips. It didn't matter if the touch was brief. A graze while passing was enough. The purpose? It was a way to keep a record of who had passed through the square during difficult weather. Later, if someone went missing or hadn't been seen for hours, people checked the memory post. The fresh thumb smudges and fingerprints in the thin layer of soot or rain-washed dust helped confirm the last sightings of neighbors without any formal system. What looked like superstition was actually a quiet method of safety. Near the village well, the oldest structure in Eldershire, another gentle rule guided water collectors. The second bucket pause. When drawing water, one had to wait a full breath between pulling up the first bucket and lowering the second. This pause gave the water time to settle, preventing silt from rising and keeping the well cleaner. The pause also created a rhythm: one breath, one bucket, one breath, one bucket, which villagers followed almost unconsciously. It became a calming ritual at dawn and dusk, a slow, patient motion that gave shape to the day. Eldershire's children obeyed an unusual rule known as the three-shadow game, though most adults had forgotten its origin. When children played outdoors near sunset, they had to gather in groups of at least 3, so each child's shadow overlapped with another. This rule had originally been a safety measure. Predators lurked in the woods during twilight, and children in larger groups were far safer than solitary ones. But over time, the rule became a playful game in which children giggled as they tried to step on one another's shadows, weaving a dance of long silhouettes stretching across the dusty roads. Then there was the rule of the harvest line, used only on the first day of reaping grain. Villagers were forbidden to cut the very first stalk in silence. Instead, they had to speak aloud the name of someone they hoped would live through the next winter: an elder, a friend, a frail neighbor, a newborn child. The belief was that speaking a hopeful name brought fortune to the harvest. But truly, the rule served another purpose. It made everyone think of one another, reminding the entire village that survival was collective, not individual. It softened hearts, eased old grudges, and strengthened bonds at the very moment hard work began. In Eldershire's small market square, there was an odd trading regulation called the mirror swap rule. When two people traded or bartered for an item of personal importance like a family tool, a wool shawl, or a cherished iron pot, they each had to tap the item once against the others. The tapping was light, almost like a clink of greeting. It wasn't mystical at all, it was practical. The tap ensured that both parties physically handled each object before agreeing to the trade, preventing disputes or misunderstandings about the condition of an item. In time, the gentle tap became a symbol of fairness. Another beloved rule guided the village's carpenters. No wood was to be cut at dawn, no matter how urgent the work. This rule came from the recognition that wood grain was more visible in the brighter light of mid-morning. Cutting too early resulted in mistakes, crooked beams, weak joints, wasted planks. So dawn became a time of preparation and sharpening tools rather than beginning work. Carpenters sipped warm drinks, stretched aching muscles, and planned their day while the sun rose quietly over the hills. Nearby, in the pasture lands, there was a rule about the clover path, a narrow route where clover grew unusually thick and sweet. Every spring, villagers let their livestock graze there first. Some believed the clover strengthened the animals after the thin winter months. But the real reason was that the soft earth beneath the clover showed footprints clearly. Allowing the animals to walk there first, let herders observe any signs of limping, illness, or injury after the long winter. It was an early gentle health check disguised as a pleasant tradition. One of Eldershire's more curious laws concerned the listening hut, a tiny wooden structure at the edge of the forest where travelers sometimes spent nights. The rule required anyone staying there to leave behind a single sentence carved into the wooden walls, a thought, a warning, or a simple message. Over generations, the hut became filled with words. "Snow comes early here. I heard wolves, but they stayed far away. Remember to rest your legs. Follow the stream, not the ridge. You're not alone, others passed here too." The hut grew into a silent companion for wandering souls, offering the comfort of knowing others had survived the night before them. Eldershire also upheld a rule known as the quiet hour, a daily moment just before noon when everyone in the village, even blacksmiths and laborers, paused work for the length of one recited prayer or poem. Originally, the rule was established to let animals rest during the hottest part of the day and to prevent exhausted workers from overheating. But as centuries slipped by, the quiet hour became a cherished pause, a moment when the entire village breathed together in stillness. Then there was the lantern on the fence rule. If someone planned to return home late, they would hang a small lantern on their fence post before leaving. The lantern wasn't lit. It simply signaled that someone was out and would return after dark. Neighbors, seeing the lantern, kept a quiet watch listening for footsteps or distant whistles making sure the traveler returned safely. It was a small gesture that replaced locks, patrols, or curfews. The simple mark of a lantern was often enough to keep the village connected and alert. In the meadows north of the village, Eldershire farmers followed the wildflower path rule, which stated that one row of wildflowers must always be left uncut at the edge of every field. Though this seemed frivolous when food was scarce, the reason was deeply practical. Wildflowers attracted bees, and bees were vital for pollination. Those remaining rows fed entire hives, which in turn pollinated crops that sustained the village. The rule ensured that beauty and survival grew side by side. And finally, there was the rule of the night ember, a gentle insistence that before the last household in the village went to sleep, someone must step outside and scatter a handful of embers near the communal hearth pit. This wasn't about superstition at all. Embers scattered on the stone circle glowed faintly for a long time, serving as a guiding light for anyone walking home late. The soft orange shimmer, barely visible but comforting, prevented falls, missteps, and wandering animals from startling people. Together, these rules, strange yet purposeful, odd yet enduring, formed the heartbeat of Eldershire. Each small tradition shaped a world where people watched over one another quietly, where survival was shared, where every action, no matter how peculiar, grew from care. And so the night stretched on, gentle and unhurried, wrapping the medieval world in its soft cloak as more quiet tales drifted from the dimly remembered corners of forgotten villages and distant manors. Another peculiar rule, seldom spoken of except in dusty manuscripts, concerned the way travelers were expected to behave when crossing empty heathlands after sunset. In some regions, especially in the colder north, the villagers believed that the vast fields, so ordinary in daylight, became vulnerable at night to wandering spirits that disliked sudden noise or the glint of metal. To prevent frightening anything unseen, or perhaps to spare travelers from meeting something they shouldn't, a peculiar custom required anyone journeying across these open plains to wrap their belongings in cloth. Swords, buckles, pots, and tools were muffled in layers of linen so they would not clink, rattle, or gleam. It was said that the sound of a metal ring echoing over a lonely moor at night might bring misfortune, though no one ever truly specified what that misfortune might be. Still, people obeyed, because the wind itself seemed to whisper reminders as it slipped over the grass in long, sighing breaths. This rule had a very real and sensible origin. Wolves. Packs roamed these areas freely, and wolves, always alert for new threats, could be startled by sharp, strange noises. A frightened wolf was unpredictable, and a traveler who accidentally provoked one might find themselves facing a dangerous encounter. So the villagers disguised the rule with superstition, and travelers complied, believing they were warding off spirits while in truth they were keeping themselves safe from territorial wildlife. It became a comforting ritual, wrapping belongings piece by piece, murmuring courteous words to whatever might be listening, then walking slowly across the night fields with only the soft sound of footsteps brushing the earth. Farther south, in the fertile valleys where farms dotted the landscape like beads on a string, another unusual rule appeared, one that puzzled outsiders but made perfect sense to the people who lived there. Every spring, before crops were planted, villagers were required to leave a small loaf of bread on the boundary stones marking the edges of each field. This was called giving back to the soil, though no one could quite agree on what exactly they were giving back. Some claimed it was an offering to ancient field spirits who had watched over the land since the first hut was built. Others insisted it was a way of sharing the previous year's fortune with the earth so the new seeds would grow strong. In truth, it started as a practical method for ensuring that boundary markers were respected. Many disputes erupted in medieval times over fields, usually because the wooden or stone markers became buried under snow, dislodged by animals, or obscured by weeds. By requiring each farmer to visit their boundaries at the same time of year, leaving something distinctive behind, the community could collectively verify the borders. The bread was never meant to feed spirits. It was simply a conspicuous item, easily noticed, letting everyone confirm that the stones were in their rightful place. But the tradition grew into something gentle and ceremonial, giving villagers a moment to reflect on their connection to the land. Even centuries later, people recalled those quiet mornings when the air smelled of dew and baking, and every field edge hosted a humble loaf glowing pale in the new sunlight. In another remote region nestled between rolling hills and weather-beaten cliffs, the inhabitants followed a rule that seemed curious to travelers. No one was allowed to whistle indoors. At first glance, this seemed like simple superstition, the sort of belief that might arise in any small, close-knit community. They claimed that whistling inside a home could call the wind, which might slip through the walls and disturb the hearth. Some said it lured mischievous spirits. Others insisted it brought quarrels into the household. To visitors, it sounded like an unnecessary restriction, something invented by particularly nervous neighbors. However, the true reason was deeply practical. The houses in the region were built with thatched roofs and wooden walls, designed to be quick to repair, but fragile. The sound of high-pitched whistling could carry into the rafters where small birds often nested during winter. Startled birds might panic, fluttering through the room, leaving droppings in grain stores, knocking over lamps, or damaging delicate beams. Since birds were essential in keeping insect populations low and thus protecting the harvest, the villagers didn't want to frighten them away. So the rule persisted, framed in folklore but rooted in sensible observation. People learned to keep their melodies outside, where the wind could carry them harmlessly away. Meanwhile, in a bustling medieval town surrounded by towering walls and crossed by narrow bridges, an odd curfew governed one of the more specific professions: the candlemakers. According to a long-standing municipal ordinance, candlemakers were forbidden from working during the twilight hours. While bakers could knead dough before dawn and smiths could hammer iron after sunset, the candlemakers were expected to close their workshops exactly when the sky shifted from gold to blue. It seemed ironic. The people responsible for producing light were not allowed to work at the very time light was needed most. The reason was neither mystical nor poetic. In earlier times, several devastating fires had broken out during the twilight period when natural light dwindled, yet lamps were not properly lit. Candlemakers, working with hot wax and open flames, were at particular risk of accidents as shadows deepened. The town leaders, desperate to prevent more destruction, implemented the rule. Though the initial concern faded from memory, the tradition remained. When twilight arrived, people would see the last thin wisps of steam escaping from the candlemakers' shop roofs as the workers banked their fires and stepped away from their tools. The rule came to be seen as a moment of peace, marking the transition from the bustling day to the gentler rhythm of evening. Beyond the town's walls and the farmlands where animals grazed and the scent of hay drifted lazily across the countryside, another peculiar rule shaped daily life: the requirement that every cow once a month had to be led before the village elder for a contentment inspection. Outsiders who heard of this custom imagined it involved elaborate ceremonies or strange rituals. In reality, it was merely a structured checkup ensuring that the cattle, the lifeblood of most medieval communities, were healthy, properly fed, and not being mistreated. The villagers knew well that a sad or neglected cow produced poor milk, struggled with illness, or failed to thrive through the harsh winter months. So what seemed like an eccentric tradition was actually an early form of animal welfare, disguised beneath a folksy flourish of words. The monthly inspections turned into gentle community gatherings. Children trailed behind their parents, giggling at the cow's solemn expressions, while the elder peered closely at hooves, hides, and tails. Farmers exchanged tips, learned from one another, and walked back home with a sense of reassurance that their animals were well cared for. The rule was not born of superstition, but of necessity. The survival of the village depended on the health of its livestock. Yet the soft, rhythmic procession of cows through the village square became a familiar, comforting sight, woven into the tapestry of local identity. Far up in the mountains, where the air thinned and the sky felt closer than anywhere else, an isolated settlement practiced a rule that astonished visitors. No one was allowed to sleep during thunderstorms. As soon as the first rumble echoed across the rocky slopes, families would gather in the center of their homes, lighting a single lamp and sitting together until the storm passed. To outsiders, this seemed an unnecessary interruption to much-needed rest, and many wondered why the community insisted on keeping everyone awake. The origins of the rule traced back to the settlement's founding, when early houses were not yet properly reinforced against lightning strikes. The region's storms were harsh and frequent, capable of splitting trees and sending sparks tumbling dangerously onto rooftops. Remaining awake during storms allowed each family to react quickly, smothering embers with wet cloths or guiding frightened animals to safety. Over time, as the buildings grew sturdier, the rule persisted out of habit and tradition. What had once been a survival tactic became a moment of togetherness, a time for quiet stories, warm drinks, and the soothing glow of a lamp dancing across walls while thunder rolled far above. Another rule, this one whispering through the dim interior of an ancient monastery, required every monk to leave a single polished stone on the windowsill before retiring to sleep. Many believed the stones represented humility or gratitude, offerings to the divine for another day completed. Others thought they symbolized the burdens carried by each person, stones left behind for the night, then taken up again at dawn. Yet the true purpose was quietly practical. The small, smooth stones, collected from the nearby river, acted as markers for the monastery's nightly head count. By counting the stones instead of waking the monks, the elder brothers could ensure that all were safely inside before the heavy wooden doors were bolted. It prevented accidents and protected travelers who occasionally sought shelter within the monastery's walls. Over decades, the practice became ritualistic, transforming a practical measure into something serene and symbolic. Not far from that monastery, in a tiny hamlet, tucked behind a dense forest, a curious rule governed the use of water at night. After dusk, villagers were forbidden to draw water from the communal well. They claimed it disturbed the spirits of the deep, who rested in the cool darkness below the surface. Lanterns were dimmed near the well, and no bucket was lowered once the stars came out. Those unfamiliar with the hamlet thought the rule strange, but the reason behind it was wise. Nighttime visibility was poor, and the well was simply too dangerous to use in the dark. One slip, one misjudged step, and a person could fall into the cold, narrow shaft. The superstition protected the villagers by wrapping caution in a cloak of folklore. And so, through valleys, forests, towns, and mountains, these peculiar medieval rules continued to shape the rhythm of life. Some were born from fear, some from caution, and others from heartfelt desires to preserve peace, protect the vulnerable, or maintain harmony with nature. Though many of the original reasons faded, woven into legend or softened into communal habits, the rules remained like quiet footprints left behind by those who came before. The night deepened around these stories, settling over them like a blanket. As each tale drifted into memory, it blended with others, forming a long, drowsy tapestry of small customs, gentle voices, and soft lantern light. And the medieval world, with all its oddities, misunderstandings, and practical wisdom hidden beneath old superstition, lay calm beneath the weight of centuries, breathing slowly as though in its own quiet sleep. And so the night wandered onward, settling gently across the old world, where villages slept beneath timber-bird roofs and quiet customs shaped the rhythm of life. As the moon climbed higher, its pale glow revealed more of those peculiar rules that once guided medieval communities, rules that now feel quaint or mysterious, yet carried deep, practical wisdom beneath their simple surfaces. In a mist-covered fishing town near the mouth of a slow river, an unusual rule governed the early morning hours. No one was allowed to speak while preparing the boats. From the moment the fishermen stepped onto the wooden planks of the dock until the last rope was untied, silence wrapped the harbor in a soft, expectant stillness. Outsiders thought it was a spiritual gesture, a way of honoring the river or listening for the voices of the deep. But the real reason lay in the fragile nature of wooden boats, which could be unpredictable under shifting weight. Silence helped the fishermen listen to the subtle creaks of strained planks, the groan of a waterlogged beam, or the faint splash that signaled a leak. In the hush of dawn, they could sense danger before it revealed itself. Over time, the silence became sacred, transforming a practical precaution into a daily ritual of quiet reflection, where the only sounds were footsteps on old boards and the gentle lap of water against hulls. Far inland, in a forest kingdom surrounded by tangled woods and mossy stones, another curious rule shaped daily life. Every household was required to leave a wooden bowl outside the front door during the first rainfall of spring. People said it was to catch the year's luck, though interpretations varied with each generation. Some believed the droplets captured in the bowl brought good fortune. Others insisted the collected rainwater held answers to unspoken questions. But the true origin was far simpler. It was a subtle way for local leaders to confirm that each family still lived in their dwelling after the long, harsh winter. If a bowl was missing or remained dry long after the rain, neighbors were alerted to check on the family. It was a quiet, compassionate method of ensuring that no one had fallen ill or gone unnoticed in the isolating cold months. What began as a survival precaution evolved into a gentle welcoming of spring, each bowl glowing softly as raindrops gathered like tiny crystals inside. In a bustling river city known for its elaborate bridges, there existed a rule that puzzled travelers. Citizens were not allowed to sweep their doorsteps on festival mornings. To the untrained eye, it looked like laziness, households leaving dust and petals scattered near their entryways. But the custom had roots deep in the city's earliest memories. Festivals drew large crowds, and in the crowded narrow streets, too much sweeping stirred clouds of fine debris into the air. People with breathing troubles suffered, children coughed, and market stalls filled with unwanted dust. So the city council had prohibited sweeping on festival days to keep the air clear and pleasant. But the origin faded, leaving behind a charming belief that sweeping on a festival morning swept away the good fortune meant to enter each home. And so the people embraced the rule with a smile, trusting that the untidy doorsteps were invitations for luck to wander in freely. In a farming village nestled between two slow-moving rivers, an unusual law dictated how and when musicians could play at night. After sunset, only string instruments were allowed. No drums, no flutes, no horns. The villagers said this kept the night gentle, preserving its softness so people could rest. But the rule began generations earlier, when loud night music frightened the livestock, causing horses to bolt, sheep to scatter, and chickens to panic in their coops. String instruments, with their soft, soothing tones, were far less disruptive, allowing people to enjoy music without risking chaos among their animals. Over time, this became a beloved tradition. Under the moonlight, groups gathered around fires with lutes, harps, and rebecks, their melodies drifting like warm smoke into the cool night air, while the fields remained calm and quiet. In the shadow of a grand stone castle perched on a windswept cliff, the townsfolk lived by a rule that struck many as strange. No one was permitted to dry clothes on the castle-facing side of their homes. They claimed it was out of respect for the noble family, who preferred uncluttered views of the town. But the real reason was tied to the unpredictable coastal winds. Gusts could whip garments from the lines, sending them tumbling into steep gulches or out to sea. The town's founders learned this through trial and error, and to prevent unnecessary loss, the rule was set. Over generations, people wove fanciful stories around it, telling children that drying clothes on the castle side would offend the wind, turning it restless and wild. And so laundry lines always stretched behind houses, flapping like colorful banners safely hidden from the cliff's dangerous currents. In a small woodland community whose cottages were built close together beneath a canopy of ancient oak trees, a curious rule required every household to extinguish lamps and candles during the full moon. When the moon rose round and luminous in the sky, windows glowed not with candlelight but with its pale, silvery sheen. Outsiders thought it was a spiritual practice, a way of honoring the moon or invoking its blessings. But the truth was rooted in practicality. Full moons were the brightest nights, and the community used them to inspect rooftops for damage, check for leaks, and observe the twisting trails that surrounded the village. With the lamps extinguished, the moonlight cast clearer shadows, revealing cracks and weaknesses in thatch or timber. The nights became a natural maintenance routine wrapped in quiet grace. And even when lanterns became safer and brighter, the tradition endured, a serene monthly moment when the village glowed softly beneath the celestial light. In a distant mountain valley where winters were long and food was scarce, the villagers followed a rule that guests found particularly odd. No one ate alone on the first day of each month. Families wandered from house to house, sharing bread, porridge, or whatever they had, ensuring that everyone from the wealthiest farmer to the poorest traveler ate beside someone else. Many believed the rule brought unity and friendship. But its origins lay in famine years when people were too proud to admit they needed help. By requiring communal meals, the villagers could quietly identify who lacked food and offer assistance without embarrassment. What began as a safeguard against starvation grew into a beloved custom of companionship, so soothing that even in prosperous times, no one wished to abandon it. Far to the west, along the windswept coast where the salty air drifted in with the tide, another curious rule took root. Each evening, before dusk, the villagers rang a small handbell 3 times in the open streets. Superstition claimed that the ringing reminded the sea to stay calm, though no one could explain how or why. But in truth, this rule dated back to a tragedy when a thick fog rolled in unexpectedly, causing fishermen returning home to drift past the harbor entrance. Hearing the bell allowed them to orient themselves in the mist, guiding them safely to shore. As years passed, the fog became less frequent, but the bell continued to ring, its clear tone echoing softly across the waterfront. A gentle reassurance that someone, somewhere was watching the horizon. In the northern plains, where tall grasses rustled like waves and the sky stretched endlessly above, a simple, but peculiar rule governed the herding of sheep. Shepherds were required to carry a piece of chalk at all times. Not for writing, as one might imagine, but for marking stones along the grazing routes. Legend claimed the chalk marks offered protection from wandering spirits that disliked straight lines. But the real reason was practical. The plains were vast and deceptively uniform, and shepherds needed ways to track their paths, identify water sources, and avoid leading their flocks into marshy ground. Chalk marks provided an easy and temporary record, guiding them safely through the landscape. Over generations, the white streaks on stones became as familiar to the villagers as constellations in the night sky. Then, in an island village surrounded by quiet waters, another peculiar rule shaped the rhythm of twilight. No one was allowed to close their shutters until the first star appeared. Some believed the open shutters welcomed blessings from the heavens. Others said that closing them too early angered the twilight spirits. But the custom began as a way to encourage vigilance, ensuring that fishermen, sailors, and travelers still out on the water were not forgotten as darkness fell. With shutters open, people could watch the sea, keep track of returning boats, and signal with lamps if needed. Over many years, the reason softened into legend, but the result remained the same. Every home glowing warm and open while the first star blinked gently to life above the sea. Across the medieval world, these strange rules flowed like gentle tributaries of old wisdom. Some were disguised as myth, some as superstition, and some as quiet tradition. Yet beneath each one lay care for the land, for the animals, for safety, for community, and for one another. And as the stories drifted onward through the soft night, they wove together into a calm, rhythmic tapestry. The kind that settles over the mind like a warm blanket, encouraging even the most restless listener to drift, slowly, easily, into peaceful rest. And so the night continued to unfurl, soft and steady, as though the world itself were exhaling after a long day. The glow of lanterns dimmed, the whispering of leaves softened, and more of those peculiar medieval customs rose like faint silhouettes from the past, each with a surface of superstition and a hidden core of wisdom. In a valley filled with orchards that blossomed in pale clouds each spring, a curious rule touched every household. Families were required to greet their apple trees at dawn during the first week of planting season. Villagers explained this as a way of keeping the trees happy or coaxing them to bear sweeter fruit. Some would touch the bark gently, others would murmur a few words of greeting as the sky brightened. Outsiders thought it charming, though undeniably odd. Yet beneath the folklore lay a simple truth. Early morning visits allowed families to check for frost damage, pest eggs, or cracked branches left unseen during winter storms. The ritual ensured the orchard's survival, disguising necessary inspections beneath the tender idea of welcoming the trees back to life. The dawn air was cool and fragrant, and entire families would stand among the blossoms, their voices little more than soft breaths. Over generations, the practical purpose faded, but the gentle greeting remained, turning each spring morning into a quiet celebration of renewal. In a far northern village, where winter lingered long after it had vanished elsewhere, another peculiar rule shaped daily habits. No one was allowed to mend clothing indoors during the darkest months. Neighbors insisted that stitching fabric inside the warm home might trap winter spirits, who disliked being disturbed. But the true reason was entirely practical. Indoor stitching required bright light, and candles were precious. By encouraging people to mend clothes outside during the daylight hours, the community conserved their limited stores of tallow and beeswax. Over time, it became an expected sight. Villagers seated on benches outside their homes, wrapped in thick furs, sewing quietly in the pale winter sun. Farther south, across rolling fields and sleeping meadows, a village with a single stone church had a rule that perplexed travelers. On the first windy day of every autumn, children were instructed to run around the village square in a full circle before going to their chores. Adults said this sent the winds on their way, ensuring they didn't linger long enough to damage roofs or shutters. But the custom began generations earlier, when the first strong winds warned of storms approaching. Sending the children running outside allowed the adults to gauge the direction and strength of the incoming weather, letting them secure what needed securing. Children, not knowing the practical purpose, carried the ritual forward with joyful enthusiasm, their laughter rising into the air as leaves swirled around them in golden spirals. In an isolated community built along a quiet lake, there was a rule requiring people to tap lightly on their doorframes before entering their own homes after sunset. Villagers claimed this gesture alerted friendly spirits that a human was entering so they would not be startled. But the custom actually had a humble origin. The wooden doorframes, built from the lake's damp timber, attracted small animals at night: frogs, mice, even nesting birds. A gentle tap caused these creatures to scurry away before someone stepped inside and accidentally disturbed them. Over decades, the tapping transformed from necessity into a soothing, familiar habit. Every night, A soft series of knocks echoed across the village, blending with the quiet ripple of water against the shore. In a bustling market town where streets wound like tangled ribbons, a peculiar rule governed the use of ladders. No one could place a ladder against the front of a building without first sprinkling a handful of ash at its base. People said the ash was meant to confuse lurking spirits who might try to climb the ladder themselves. But the true reason was much more down to earth. Ash on the ground helped prevent slipping on uneven cobblestones. The dusty layer gave workers better footing, especially in a town where rain and spilled water often left the stones slick. Over time, the practical purpose faded into myth, but the ash sprinkling ritual remained, adding a strange but steady rhythm to the morning preparations of carpenters and painters. In a remote hamlet hidden between swaying pines, another curious rule touched the daily responsibilities of its inhabitants. Each morning, before sunrise, one member of every household was required to walk a short distance from the village center and listen for the distant sounds of the forest. People believed this allowed them to hear the forest's mood, whether it was calm, restless, or watchful. But this practice originated from the need to detect early signs of danger, approaching storms, predators, or traveling strangers. A village that listened carefully to the world around it stayed safe. Over the centuries, the habit transformed into something almost meditative. Villagers would stand at the edge of the path, surrounded by trees swaying in pride-on silence, breathing in the crisp air as the world prepared to wake. In a river market famed for its woven baskets, there existed a rule that forbade merchants from displaying their baskets upside down. The villagers said that doing so invited emptiness and would doom a merchant's earnings for the day. But the actual reason was far simpler. Baskets stored upside down collected dust, insects, and fallen debris from the bustling marketplace. By mandating their proper orientation, the town ensured cleaner wares and healthier customers. Still, generations later, the superstition lingered. Merchants would glance nervously at their baskets each morning, flipping any that leaned even slightly, their movements quick and instinctive, as though they could feel fortune itself hanging in the air. In a village surrounded by endless fields of flowers, there was a rule concerning colors. On one specific day each summer, no one was allowed to wear red. People claimed it was a day devoted to warding off fiery spirits or giving thanks to the earth. But the custom began as a method to protect villagers from swarms of bees during peak pollination. Bright red clothing attracted the insects, and after several painful incidents, elders implemented the rule. Over time, it became a celebration. A day when all wore blues, greens, yellows, and whites, blending with the fields around them like petals stirred by a gentle breeze. Children came to call it the quiet day, because even the bees seemed calmer when the villagers moved like soft colors among the blooms. In a desert settlement far from rivers or lakes, an unusual rule touched each morning's routine. Before anyone drank the first sip of water at sunrise, they were required to pour a few drops onto the earth. Elders explained that the gesture honored spirits sleeping beneath the sand. Yet the true purpose was rooted in gratitude and restraint, a quiet reminder to use water wisely in a place where it was more precious than gold. The brief shimmering splash on the dry ground created a fleeting moment of coolness and fragrance, enough to awaken reflection. Over generations, the people continued the ritual, treating water with reverence long after the original reason was forgotten. And still the night carried on, slow and steady, weaving these gentle stories together like threads in a large, dreamy tapestry. Each rule, odd at first glance, was born from careful observation, empathy, or necessity. And though time softened their edges and cloaked them in myth, their wisdom lingered, hidden quietly beneath centuries of tradition. The medieval world, with all its quirks and whispered customs, seemed to breathe softly in the darkness. A world guided by rules that appeared strange but ultimately kept families safe, communities united, and the fragile balance of life gently preserved. As dawn trickled gently across the medieval landscape, spreading threads of silver light over thatched rooftops and fields still wrapped in dew, there emerged another rule that carried an almost mythical whisper about it. Water from the first well must not be drawn twice. To visitors, the tradition seemed impractical. Water was precious, and wells were not abundant. Why limit anyone to a single bucket at dawn? But villagers understood the wisdom behind the custom. The first bucket drawn before sunrise was believed to carry sediment disturbed after the well settled overnight. Taking only one allowed people to test its clarity, observe its taste, and ensure that no contamination or decay had seeped in through cracks during the night. A second bucket could stir the sediment further, making the water appear safe even if the first bucket had revealed something wrong. Thus, the practice became a quiet ritual of caution. People approached the well with hushed footsteps, lifted a single bucket, examined it in the faint glow of morning, and decided whether the water was good. If it wasn't, the town sent word to boil their stores and investigate. It was a small, silent practice that kept entire communities healthy in a world where illness lurked unseen. And in the same gentle rhythm of protection, another rule woven into daily life declared, candles must be snuffed before a storm touches the horizon. Medieval homes were built from wood, straw, and pitch, materials eager to catch fire if neglected. A distant storm didn't only bring wind and lightning. It brought drafts sharp enough to tilt candle flames into sudden, dangerous flickers. A single gust sweeping through an unlatched window could send sparks tumbling onto bedding, cloth, or the dry reeds of a roof. So families watched the sky with almost instinctive attentiveness. When the dark edge of a storm rose like a gathering shadow at the rim of the world, someone moved quietly through the home, pinching wicks gently between wetted fingertips or snuffing them beneath clay covers. The resulting dimness felt almost ceremonial, a moment of respect for the approaching power of nature. Many rules emerged from watching skies, for the medieval world lived in close conversation with weather. But some rules came not from the heavens but from the earth itself. In forested regions, one long-standing decree held, no chopping wood after sunset. This command might seem restrictive, especially during cold seasons when warmth meant survival. But the reasoning behind it was grounded firmly in safety. Woodcutting was loud, the rhythmic thud of axe against trunk echoing for great distances. After dark, those sounds could mask the approach of animals or bandits. Worse yet, in dim light, even a skilled woodcutter risked injury from misjudging a swing or from stumbling on hidden roots or wet leaves. By limiting woodcutting to daylight hours, villages kept their people safe from both danger and misfortune. As night descended, forests grew still. Wind sighed through branches, and the silence served as a protective blanket, wrapping the village in a calm that felt almost sacred. Closer to towns and manors, another strange yet practical rule circulated. Bread must be marked before baking. To modern eyes, those little slashes or symbols etched onto dough might seem merely decorative. But in the medieval marketplace, long before standardized weights or regulated ovens, marking bread was essential. Every family, baker, or household used unique cuts or symbols so that loaves could be identified after baking, important in communal ovens where dozens of families baked at once. Without these markings, disputes spilled into arguments, mistaken claims, or accusations of taking more than one's share. A few etched lines maintained peace. They allowed the oven tender, often a respected position, to return loaves swiftly to the right owner. And in a world where bread was life, such order mattered. Yet the rules only grew stranger as one traveled farther. In the mountain towns, where winter clung fiercely and snowstorms could swallow entire herds, a curious saying held legal weight. Every doorway must speak. This wasn't meant literally, of course, but referred instead to the practice of hanging small wooden chimes, bone rattles, or strings of metal trinkets above thresholds. When heavy snow piled against doors during the night, pressing inward with silent force, these hanging objects warned families with soft, muffled rattles or clicks. If a door bent under the weight, the faint sounds would wake sleepers in time to shovel snow away before the pressure caused collapse. Thus the door spoke, and its voice saved lives in ways no one fully realized until the custom had already become ancient. Farther south, where heat shimmered across fields and insects thrived, another rule quietly shaped everyday life. No lanterns near the herb-drying racks. Herbs hung from rafters, beams, and lattice frames, precious medicinal plants gathered through spring and summer. Their oils were potent and, when dried, incredibly flammable. Lantern flames could catch on a hanging sprig of thyme or lavender, turning an entire storehouse into a blaze that would wipe out months of careful harvesting. The rule banned open flame in those spaces entirely, preserving a village's healing supplies for winter when they were most needed. People obeyed instinctively. They navigated drying barns by the soft glow of moonlight slipping through slits in the wood or by carrying dim, shielded embers in tightly sealed pottery jars. The quiet darkness became a place of reverence, for those herbs were the village's lifeline. And still, more rules flowed through daily life, the kind that sound almost whimsical but held profound purpose. There was the decree that horses must face north when saddled at dawn. A traveler might laugh the first time they heard it, but turning horses north helped them acclimate to early light without being blinded by the rising sun. Horses startled easily when light struck their eyes suddenly. A startled horse could injure itself, bolt, or throw a rider. Facing them northward grounded them, calming their breath and allowing the day to begin smoothly. In many marshside towns, another rule took hold. Bridges must rest at night. Bridges of old were not built with the strength of later centuries. Many were made of rope, woven reeds, or wood softened by constant moisture. Letting them rest simply meant closing them from use during the night, when weariness or poor visibility could lead someone to misstep or fall. People crossed by daylight, with clear footing and watchful eyes, preserving both the bridge and the travelers who depended on it. And woven through all of these was a rule that bound communities together by necessity. Every home must share fire once a month. In some villages, this rule took the form of extinguishing all household flames on a chosen night and relighting them from a communal fire tended in the town square. It reminded families that fire, the heart of survival, was a shared resource, a gift that required cooperation. It prevented unhealthy isolation, encouraged exchange, and ensured that anyone who had lost their hearth flame to wind, illness, or misfortune would never be left without warmth or the means to cook. The ritual was beautiful in its simplicity. As the story of these strange but sensible customs stretches onward like a lantern-lit road through the centuries, you begin to realize that the medieval world was shaped less by chaos and more by a delicate understanding of how fragile daily life truly was. Each rule, no matter how curious, carried with it a quiet logic, a gentle protection woven into ordinary routines. And so we come to another peculiar regulation found in several river villages. Nets must sleep on land. This rule meant that fishing nets, no matter how tired the fishermen were after long hours on the water, could not be left soaking overnight. At first glance, it sounded unnecessary. But villagers knew that leaving nets submerged after dusk weakened the cords, softened the knots, and sometimes attracted scavenging animals that chewed through the fibers. Worse yet, unattended nets could drift away with the changing tide and be lost entirely. Bringing nets ashore allowed them to dry in the cool night air, preserving their strength for the next day. It saved countless fishermen from returning at dawn only to discover their tools deteriorated or gone. And so, on every riverbank, as the last glow of sunset faded, nets were lifted carefully from the water and laid in neat, sleeping lines along the grass, a sight so common that people rarely questioned it. In the heart of market towns, another curious decree guided daily commerce. No bartering after the third bell. The third bell rang in the late afternoon, signaling the end of trading. The rule prevented merchants from haggling in dim light when mistakes were easier and shadows made it difficult to see coin, grain, or fabric quality. Nighttime deals led to misunderstandings or disputes that could brew long-lasting tension. But when the third bell tolled, echoing gently through cobblestone streets, sellers folded their cloth, secured their goods, and closed their stalls. It was a peaceful ending to the chaos of the marketplace, a reminder that even prosperity needed boundaries to remain harmonious. In many villages, there also existed the intriguing rule that no one may whistle near the granary. Though it might sound like superstition, it was really a practical measure wrapped in folklore. Whistling attracted birds, or so people believed, and birds could wreak havoc on stored grain. Even if the truth was more complicated, the rule served its purpose. No cheerful tune, no rhythmic whistle, no idle melody was ever heard near the granary walls. Instead, the area remained quiet, guarded by the gentle caution of people who understood how easily a season's harvest could vanish. At night, when the wind brushed against the high wooden doors, the silence felt almost holy. Traveling onward through this drifting landscape of ancient customs, one arrives at a particularly quaint rule found in hillside hamlets. Milk must greet the morning. This meant that fresh milk was to be poured or used only after sunlight had touched the pail. The belief and the practical truth behind it was that early morning light helped farmers inspect the color and quality of the milk more clearly. By waiting for dawn, they could spot any signs of spoilage or contamination. Although no one spoke of it formally, the rule helped families avoid illness caused by drinking milk too quickly after milking in dim pre-dawn darkness. And so, each morning, milk pails glowed softly beneath the sun, warming gently before being carried inside. In more remote villages where cold fogs drifted thick as wool, another unusual mandate guided neighbors through the mists. Carry straw in fog. The requirement was simple. Anyone walking in heavy fog was to carry a twist of dry straw in hand or tied to their belt. The straw was used to test the dampness of the air and, more importantly, to keep track of direction by feeling how the wind moved through its fibers. Even in moments when visibility shrank to almost nothing, a person could hold out the straw and feel which way the faint breath of wind was blowing, allowing them to orient themselves and avoid wandering off the path. It prevented countless accidents and helped villagers return home safely, even when the world vanished into whiteness. Then there was the gentle, almost poetic rule found near quiet monasteries and peaceful farmlands: water the path before the procession. Before religious or ceremonial walks, people sprinkled water along dusty roads. It kept the dust from rising, prevented coughing, and preserved the dignity of the event. But beyond that practicality, villagers cherished the ritual itself. Watching elders lightly scatter water along the earth with woven ladles felt calming, symbolic, as if the path were being blessed with coolness and clarity. The rule created a serene atmosphere, turning simple dirt roads into soft avenues of hush and reverence. And in many places, another soft-spoken rule shaped life inside homes. The hearth must never be left alone. While it might seem obvious today, medieval hearths were the heart of the home. They provided warmth, light, and the means to cook, but they were also unpredictable. Sparks could jump, logs could roll, embers could flare when stirred by draft. Leaving a hearth unattended even briefly was dangerous in houses built with wood, straw, and dry rush mats. So someone was always assigned to mind the flame, a child learning responsibility, a parent tidying, an elder humming softly. There was a sense of companionship between people and fire, a kind of wordless agreement to watch over one another. The rule created a strange, comforting continuity. The hearth was never alone, and neither were the people. But perhaps no rule drew more curious glances from outsiders than the one practiced in orchard towns. Speak kindly to fruit trees. Though it may seem whimsical, or even childish, the custom was rooted in real horticultural understanding. Orchard keepers believed that gentle voices and calm movements kept workers relaxed and prevented sudden jerks that could damage delicate branches. They discouraged shouting or arguments beneath the trees, for harsh motions often led to broken buds or bruised fruit. And in truth, a calm worker always treated the trees more gently. So the rule became a kind of poetic discipline. Orchard rows echoed with softly spoken greetings, quiet singing, or murmured stories, all carried on warm breezes that brushed through leaves like whispers. Even animals sometimes had rules fashioned around them. In several farming regions stood the decree: roosters must greet the gate, not the door. Roosters were tethered or encouraged to stay near the gates rather than close to homes. Their crowing at dawn was vital for keeping time, but if they settled too near sleeping quarters, they startled families awake too early. By guiding them toward the edge of properties, villagers ensured the crowing carried just enough distance to wake everyone gently, not abruptly. The rhythm of morning depended on it. In bustling port towns, meanwhile, there was yet another rule: salt must touch the deck before the voyage. Before ships set sail, the crew sprinkled a handful of salt on the wooden boards. While some believed it was symbolic protection, its purpose was practical. Salt water helped keep planks slightly damp and flexible at the start of a journey, reducing the chance that sudden dryness or heat would cause cracks. Over time, the ritual preserved more ships than sailors realized. And so, with a single sprinkling, voyages began with quiet confidence. The medieval world was stitched together by hundreds of these small, thoughtful practices. They acted as invisible threads of wisdom, guiding people through days filled with uncertainty. What looked peculiar to later generations was simply a map of survival, drawn not on parchment but in habit, tradition, and lived experience. As the medieval world continued its quiet turn beneath the stars, more curious rules emerged from the rhythm of daily life, each shaped by centuries of observation, caution, and the simple desire to keep life steady in an unpredictable age. One such rule, perhaps one of the most surprising, governed the weaving houses found in towns where textiles were as essential as grain. No thread may cross another after sunset. To someone unfamiliar with the craft, the command might seem poetic or arbitrary. But linen and wool threads were delicate, especially when stretched across large looms in dimly lit workshops. In the evenings, when candlelight flickered and shadows trembled across beams and spindles, the smallest misstep could cause knots, tangles, or snapped fibers that ruined entire yards of cloth. By banning weaving after dark, the rule protected both the materials and the weavers, who risked straining their eyes or pricking their fingers in the low light. As the sun dipped and softened the world, looms quieted one by one. Threads hung loose and peaceful, waiting for morning brightness to guide steady hands once more. Not far from weaving towns, in stone-built settlements surrounded by rolling farmlands, another humble yet important rule circulated: tools must sleep facing east. The farm tools, hoes, spades, sickles, were placed with their handles pointing eastward when stored at night. While it might appear ritualistic, the practice kept cutting edges turned safely inward, away from paths where someone might step during pre-dawn chores. Pointing them east also served as a way to ensure everyone stored tools uniformly, reducing clutter and preventing accidents in barns where light was minimal. At dawn, when farmers rose to greet the morning in the cool, pale stillness, the tools pointed neatly toward the rising sun, ready for the day's labor. And in many forest-bordering towns, where woodcutters and carpenters lived side by side, another peculiar decree held steady through generations. Whittling is forbidden indoors. The rule prevented slivers of wood from scattering across floors, where animals or children might step on them. But it also served a deeper purpose, keeping fire at bay. Dry wood shavings ignited easily, and in houses warmed by open flames, even a small spark could start a catastrophic fire. By requiring all whittling to be done outdoors, villages kept their homes safe from the silent danger of accumulating tinder. The sound of whittling, soft scraping, steady and thoughtful, thus became part of the outdoor landscape, drifting in warm breezes beneath wooden eaves. In hillside monasteries and secluded pilgrim towns, there lived another curious rule: shoes must rest before the threshold. Travelers entering sacred spaces were required to remove their shoes not only as a sign of respect but also to prevent dust and debris from wearing down ancient stone floors. Many monasteries maintained polished walkways of limestone or marble, surfaces easily scratched or damaged by grit caught in leather soles. By leaving shoes aside for a moment, the echoing halls remained serene and untouched. Barefoot steps created a soft, almost reverent atmosphere in those quiet, candlelit spaces. Even today, imagining the cool stone beneath one's feet brings forth a sense of calm. But not all rules were soft or ceremonial. Some emerged from necessity, so practical they became woven into the very identity of certain regions. In marshlands where fog hovered low and water stretched silently between reed beds, one unusual law shaped nighttime movement: carry a light low, not high. People exploring dark marsh paths were required to carry lanterns close to the ground. The low angle illuminated dips, roots, and shallow pools directly ahead, hazards that could easily swallow a foot or twist an ankle. But just as importantly, a lantern held low helped travelers see the reflection of eyes in the reeds, animals moving nearby, or in rare cases human silhouettes in the mist. High lanterns blinded the holder and cast tall, distorted shadows that confused the path. Low lanterns grounded the traveler, guiding each step with quiet certainty. Farther inland, in stone-walled towns perched atop ridges, another peculiar but vital rule echoed through winter months. Snow must fall from the roof before it falls from the sky. As odd as it sounded, the rule meant residents were required to clear rooftops of old snow before a new snowfall arrived. Roofs, built from wooden beams and overlaid with clay tiles or heavy thatch, were vulnerable to collapse under too much weight. By keeping them clear, villagers ensured their homes survived the harshest storms without surrendering to the silent burden of winter. Thus, before each snowfall, families climbed carefully atop their homes, brushing snow down in soft, cascading piles that muffled the night. The air filled with drifting crystals, shimmering in lantern light, a peaceful, almost meditative task. And perhaps one of the most quietly thoughtful rules appeared in orchard villages where carpenters and gardeners shared the land. Ladders must dream on their sides. At the end of each workday, ladders were laid flat on the ground instead of propped upright against trees or walls. This prevented wind from knocking them over and injuring passers-by. But on a gentler level, it also discouraged children from climbing unsupervised. A ladder on its side held no temptation. A ladder upright seemed to beckon curious feet. The rule protected both little ones and elders, and in its simplicity lay a kind of quiet wisdom. Yet the medieval world had still more curious customs, shaped by necessity and experience, such as the decree observed in many dairy towns. Cheese must listen before it turns. This poetic phrasing masked a practical truth. Cheese wheels, during their aging process, were often turned at specific intervals based on environmental cues. One of those cues was sound, listening for droplets falling in cellars, for the scurrying of mice, for echoes of moisture that signaled dampness in aging rooms. Cheesemakers learned to trust their ears as much as their eyes. Before turning a wheel, they listened. Not to the cheese itself, of course, but to the room around it, letting sound guide them toward quality and care. And in many regions, especially where winds swept through open plains, another peculiar but wise mandate existed. Keep water beneath the wind. This meant placing water barrels or buckets on the side of the house protected from the prevailing wind. Flying sparks, drifting embers, or sudden gusts could send dry debris tumbling into open containers. By placing water in sheltered spots, villagers prevented contamination and maintained cleaner supplies, essential for both cooking and brewing. The rule turned every home into a small map of wind patterns and protective corners. These customs, strange, delicate, thoughtful, formed the quiet grammar of medieval life. They reminded people of danger, community, nature, and patience. They wove routine into safety and turned ordinary gestures into acts of preservation. And as night deepened again across this timeless world of faint candlelight, slow footsteps, and soft murmuring fields, one truth remained clear. What seems peculiar to us now was once the steady heartbeat of survival, a collection of bedtime soft, lived-in rules that carried entire generations safely from one dawn to the next. In the quiet streets of medieval towns, life might seem chaotic at first glance, with the clatter of carts, the cries of merchants, and the constant bustle of people moving about their daily business. But beneath the surface, the seemingly bizarre rules that govern life were often rooted in practicality, designed to protect, organize, and sustain communities that lacked modern conveniences. Take, for instance, the rule that forbade women from wearing certain colors unless they were of noble birth. To the modern eye, it might look like an arbitrary restriction, but in reality, it served as a clear visual code, instantly identifying social rank and preventing disputes over status, property, or privilege. Color was currency in its own right, a silent language of respect and hierarchy, and understanding it kept towns functioning smoothly. In markets, there were laws dictating how and when butchers could sell meat. One rule, odd by today's standards, required that meat be displayed in a specific manner to ensure it was fresh. This wasn't vanity, it was public health. Towns relied on communal oversight to prevent disease, and by forcing vendors to adhere to visual standards, authorities ensured that spoiled meat didn't circulate and make people sick. Similarly, bakers were required to mark loaves in a particular pattern, not for artistry, but for accountability. If a baker sold underweight bread, the markings allowed inspectors to trace the error back to its source, a system that reduced cheating and kept families fed properly. Even travel had its peculiar rules. Nighttime wandering was often restricted, with towns requiring residents to carry lanterns or bells. While it may sound oppressive, these rules protected against accidents in dimly lit streets and prevented theft and assault. A town might impose fines for leaving the city gates without a torch because darkness was dangerous, not because rulers simply enjoyed control in movement. Similarly, some towns banned people from raising pigs in the streets. At first glance it appears humorous, imagining citizens herding pigs past churches. But pigs could spread disease, destroy crops, and cause chaos if left unchecked. Rules about animal management were practical interventions disguised as strictures. One of the most curious rules involved public bathing. In certain cities, men and women were prohibited from sharing the same bathhouses at certain times. Today, this might seem prudish or absurd, but communal baths were crowded, slippery, and hot. Strict schedules prevented accidents, inappropriate encounters, and disease transmission. It was a system designed to balance hygiene with modesty and safety. Even sanitation rules that required streets to be swept daily or for residents to dispose of waste properly, though often ignored, were early attempts at public health policy. Medieval towns may have lacked modern plumbing, but their leaders understood that filth spread disease, and laws, even strange ones, were the first line of defense. Feasting and celebration had their own odd regulations. Certain festivals prohibited the consumption of specific foods or drinks, often for reasons of preservation. A city might restrict wine consumption to certain days to avoid drunken brawls or prevent spoilage in storage. Similarly, some areas banned hunting at specific times of the year, a rule that sounds odd unless one considers the necessity of maintaining animal populations. Overhunting could devastate local ecosystems, reduce available food, and destabilize the economy. Rules that might seem arbitrary today were, in fact, sophisticated attempts to balance natural resources and human enjoyment. Even the architecture of homes and public buildings was shaped by strange-seeming rules. Some towns required that houses be built a certain distance apart or that roofs slope in specific ways. These rules weren't decorative. They protected against fire spread, allowed sunlight and airflow, and ensured that neighboring properties weren't at risk of collapse during storms. Urban planning in medieval times was not haphazard. It relied on observation, experience, and legislation, resulting in towns that were safer than they appeared to modern eyes. Merchants faced rules that dictated not just pricing but behavior. One law prohibited shopkeepers from arguing with customers loudly in the street. Odd as it sounds, this rule preserved social harmony and prevented market disputes from escalating into violence. Trade was the lifeblood of towns, and maintaining a sense of order was more important than individual temper tantrums. Likewise, apprentices in workshops were bound by strict rules about how they could move, speak, and even eat during working hours. To us, these seem oppressive, but the structure ensured that skills were transmitted efficiently, tools were not wasted, and workplaces remained productive. Even clothing had legal implications beyond color codes. Tailors had to follow strict measurements and labeling, ensuring garments fit the buyer and could be traced back to the maker. These rules reduced fraud and disputes, especially important in a world without standard sizing. Shoes, belts, and hats were regulated to maintain modesty, indicate social status, and prevent theft or impersonation. A hat could indicate profession, rank, or wealth, and violating these codes could spark conflicts. Medical rules, too, were sometimes bizarre but sensible for the time. Certain herbs or remedies were restricted to licensed practitioners, not out of elitism but to prevent poisoning and improper treatments. Physicians had to record treatments meticulously. Failure to do so could result in fines. While medieval medicine seems primitive to modern eyes, these regulations helped prevent disasters, preserved knowledge, and kept communities healthier than an entirely unregulated system might have. Even seemingly trivial rules, like curfews on bells or prohibitions on whistling at night, had practical purposes. Bells marked time, regulated labor, and alerted citizens to danger. Whistling might attract unwanted attention, startle animals, or be confused with signals of distress. Rules that sound strange today often had safety, clarity, or economic reasoning behind them. Some of the most fascinating regulations dealt with social interaction. Laws governed how people could greet each other, how disputes were mediated, and even how rumors were punished. Gossip could destabilize trade, incite violence, or threaten reputations. By codifying behavior, towns minimized conflict and maintained cohesion. Neighborly interactions, while structured in ways we might find tedious or odd, were critical to survival in tightly packed communities where cooperation was essential. In towns with rivers or canals, rules governed navigation, fishing, and water usage. Certain stretches might be restricted for transport of goods at specific hours, preventing congestion and accidents. Fishing rights were regulated to ensure species survival and maintain food supply. Water, being essential for drinking, cooking, washing, and industry, required careful management. Rules about water flow, usage, and maintenance were some of the most practical medieval laws, preserving both life and livelihood. Even public punishments followed regulated procedures. Stocks, pillories, and fines were not arbitrary cruelty but a structured system of deterrence. Procedures ensured fairness, prevented mob justice, and served as a visual reminder of consequences. Laws against theft, assault, and slander were enforced publicly, teaching lessons without descending into chaos. These punishments, strange or harsh by modern standards, were deeply practical tools for maintaining order. Over time, towns developed intricate legal codes covering everything from agriculture to arts and crafts. Rules about crop rotation, animal breeding, and tool maintenance may sound bizarre now, but they were the backbone of food security. Failure to follow these rules could result in famine, disease, or economic collapse. Similarly, regulations about hunting, fishing, and foraging were practical measures to ensure sustainable resources for generations. Even entertainment was not free from regulation. Minstrels, actors, and performers had restrictions on when, where, and how they could perform. While it might appear arbitrary, controlling performance times prevented noise complaints, maintained public order, and ensured fair competition. Festivals, fairs, and tournaments were carefully coordinated, balancing amusement with safety and economic opportunity. In essence, medieval towns were governed by layers upon layers of seemingly peculiar rules. Many were cumbersome, some rigid, and others oddly specific. Yet behind each regulation was a thread of logic, often tied to safety, economy, health, or social harmony. What appears whimsical to modern eyes is, upon closer inspection, a testament to the ingenuity of communities navigating a complex, unpredictable world without technology, fast communication, or modern science. Sleep now drifts over these towns and villages, imagining streets empty except for the occasional lantern, shops closed after a day of careful work, and residents safely tucked into beds. The rules, strange as they seemed, created order in chaos, protected lives, and guided people through the challenges of medieval life. Though centuries have passed and most of these laws have faded into history, their purpose remains clear. They were survival tools in a world that demanded foresight, caution, and communal effort. And as the night deepens, one can almost hear the echo of town criers, the rhythmic sweep of brooms, and the distant toll of bells reminders that even the weirdest rules were born from necessity, shaping societies in ways we may never fully realize. The wisdom embedded in these peculiar regulations reflects a human instinct for structure, safety, and fairness. From market stalls to bathhouses, from livestock pens to narrow streets, from apprentice workshops to noble courts, every law had a reason, often hidden beneath layers of custom and tradition. What may seem like whimsy today was once the backbone of survival, the invisible hand guiding communities toward order and security. As sleep takes over, imagine walking down a quiet medieval street. The air filled with the scent of fresh bread, the glow of lanterns flickering in the windows, and a sense of peace born from countless rules followed diligently. Every rule, however odd, was a quiet guardian of life, protecting families, neighbors, and strangers alike. And so the medieval world, with its strange and fascinating laws, continues to whisper its lessons to those willing to listen, showing that even in the past, human ingenuity found ways to make life safer, fairer, and more manageable. In the end, the weirdness of medieval rules is not a reflection of their absurdity but of their profound practicality. Strange as they may appear, they were designed for survival, for harmony, and for the greater good. Each decree, however minor, contributed to a delicate balance, a rhythm of life that allowed towns to thrive in a world full of uncertainty. And as you drift further into slumber, let the quiet logic of these old laws lull you into dreams of lantern-lit streets bustling, markets, and the gentle hum of communities bound together by wisdom, necessity, and a touch of peculiar medieval charm. As night settles fully over the medieval towns, the silence becomes a soft companion. Even the rules themselves seem to rest, their purpose quietly fulfilled. Consider the laws around lighting hearths and fireplaces. Towns required that chimneys be cleared regularly and that fires not be left unattended. At first, it might seem overly cautious, but fire was one of the greatest hazards of medieval life. A single spark could consume entire streets, and these rules were early forms of fire prevention, protecting neighbors, homes, and livelihoods alike. The meticulous attention to detail in enforcing such rules shows a world acutely aware of its fragility and its resilience. Even in the realm of leisure, regulations prevailed for good reasons. Archery, a popular pastime and a vital military skill, was often regulated by law. Certain towns required men to practice at specific ranges and maintain their own bows and arrows. What might seem like unnecessary meddling was actually an investment in communal defense. By ensuring that citizens were skilled in archery, towns were prepared for raids or attacks. Similarly, Rules around fencing, jousting, or other martial games dictated safety gear and permitted techniques, preventing injury while promoting skill development. Play and preparation were intertwined, safety and fun walking hand in hand. Travelers were also subject to curious restrictions, many of which were rooted in protection. Inns had rules about how many guests could be accommodated, how animals were stabled, and how goods were stored. Roads, bridges, and ferries were regulated, with tolls and permits controlling traffic flow. At night, travelers were expected to keep fires or lights burning to avoid accidents or attacks. Seemingly trivial, these rules maintained order and minimized danger. The strange and rigid protocols for travel were, in essence, a medieval form of traffic law and public safety, ensuring journeys were as safe as possible. Even the food people ate was governed by regulations that now seem odd but were crucial at the time. Fish, a staple in medieval diets, had strict rules dictating when it could be caught and sold, especially during religious periods like Lent. These rules helped sustain fish populations and ensure fairness in trade. Grain and bread had their own legal codes, with penalties for hoarding or underweight loaves. Salt, a valuable preservative, was carefully controlled through laws that balanced supply, pricing, and fairness. What may appear pedantic today was actually a sophisticated system designed to maintain nutrition, commerce, and social stability. Education, too, had its peculiar restrictions. Apprenticeships in trades required strict adherence to rules about hours, conduct, and training methods. Students in monastic schools followed rigid routines for prayer, study, and rest. These seemingly strict practices were not meant to oppress but to instill discipline, ensure skill acquisition, and preserve knowledge in a world without mass printing or formal institutions. Even the mundane, like the order in which candles were lit in a classroom or library, had purpose. It created an environment conducive to learning while protecting precious resources. Public gatherings and festivals were also tightly regulated. Fireworks, if they existed, had rules about placement and timing. Music and dance had restrictions on volume, location, and duration. Markets and fairs were monitored to prevent overcrowding, theft, or disruption. These rules ensured enjoyment while protecting safety, commerce, and social harmony. The seemingly arbitrary restrictions were, in truth, clever solutions to complex problems in crowded, lively communities. Even death had its own set of odd rules. Burial procedures were regulated to prevent disease, respect religious customs, and avoid disputes over property. Graves had to be dug at certain depths, locations were prescribed, and ceremonies were timed according to custom and law. While these rules might appear morbid or overly meticulous, they reflected an understanding of hygiene, social responsibility, and respect for the dead. Funerals were communal events, and regulations ensured that mourning did not become chaos. And then there were rules about water use, personal hygiene, and pest control, all of which might seem humorous today. Citizens were sometimes fined for not cleaning streets in front of their homes or for allowing animals to roam unchecked. Public wells had regulations to prevent contamination, while bathing houses enforced schedules to avoid overcrowding and promote modesty. Flea and rat control was sometimes mandated, as these tiny pests could devastate communities with disease. Each odd small rule contributed to survival, comfort, and communal health. As the first light of dawn approaches, imagine the quiet streets awakening under the gentle rules that guided every action. Merchants prepare their stalls, bakers remove fresh bread from the ovens, and children follow paths laid down by centuries of custom. The laws, both strange and practical, continue to serve their purpose, maintaining order, protecting lives, and fostering harmony. Every seemingly odd regulation has its place in this intricate tapestry of medieval life, and through them, towns thrive despite limited technology, unpredictable weather, and the constant challenges of survival. Even today, the echoes of these rules remain in the structure of modern life. Fire codes, traffic laws, building regulations, and public health policies all have roots in these early medieval systems. The wisdom of necessity, distilled through centuries of observation and experience, reminds us that rules, no matter how peculiar, often exist for the greater good. And so, as sleep gently carries you into dreams, picture a medieval town bathed in soft morning light, streets orderly, homes safe, markets bustling, and communities protected by the unseen but ever-present logic of their laws. Every rule, every restriction, every curious custom existed for a reason, ensuring survival, safety, and social harmony. What seems strange or whimsical is, in truth, a testament to human ingenuity, care, and foresight. Let the quiet rhythm of this ancient world lull you, the gentle order of towns guided by careful rules washing over your mind like a soft tide. Know that even the weirdest medieval laws were born from necessity and reason, shaping a world that was far more thoughtful, deliberate, and secure than it might first appear. The streets are peaceful, the hearths warm, and life continues in a delicate balance maintained by centuries of wisdom. Rest now, knowing that the past, with all its peculiar rules and strange customs, had purpose, logic, and care at its heart. And as dreams take hold, drift along the lantern-lit lanes, past the markets and workshops, past the rivers and bridges, guided by the invisible hand of medieval laws that kept communities safe, fair, and thriving. Let the gentle hum of history soothe you, carrying you deeper into sleep, where the wisdom of ages whispers softly, reminding you that even the strangest rules may have the best of reasons.